Ancient History 206, Lesson 7, the Sumerian Timeline. And today we're going to do what I intended to do in two lessons in one because our friends in the administration level have given us the word that we had an extra day in the calendar because Veterans Day was not scheduled to be a day off. So that's why I sent out a revised syllabus. So we are going to attempt to get through the Sumerian timeline in one lesson instead of two. Mm-hmm. Interesting. I will go take a look at that after class. Remind me at the end. Um, so, this is just a pictograph showing the basic timeline from Mesopotamia in general. It's not necessary even to be able to read it. What I mostly wanted you to see is that this is a timeline for the entire region of Mesopotamia, not just Sumer, but it shows you just how old secular history thinks the history of Mesopotamia is. And here's another example of that. This is of course, a drawing of the map of ancient Mesopotamia. You can see Abram's hometown of Uruk, one of the dynastic cities of Sumer. There's the title of Sumer, Babylon, and in the region of Akkad, and Nineveh, which, of course, is the capital of the Assyrians or Ashur's people in the north. So, and what you can see in this slide is that the Ubaid culture of Sumer is actually apparently set all the way back pre-flood, which is exactly what the Sumerian Kings list says, right? That their earliest civilization at Eridu, the first capital of Sumer, was a pre-flood civilization that was rebuilt after the flood. The Uruk period goes from the 5th millennia through the second half of the 4th millennia, and then the period of the Sumerian states goes from the middle part of the 4th millennia to the latter part of the 3rd millennia. Obviously, as a biblical historian, I don't agree with all of these dates, but the timeline of the history of the Sumerian culture is not entirely inaccurate. You'll note that the history of Babylon begins with the Akkadians and continues with the Amorites and the Kassites, and later the Chaldeans, or what we think of as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar. The Assyrians do not come into prominence until about 1800 BC, and then we see short periods of their, if you will, their dominance in the 1200s and in the 800s and in the 7th century. Persia is always there. The Elamites become the Persians become mingled with the Medes, and they're always present, but they never become a dominant world power until they conquer the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 525 BC. So it's interesting that the Elamites are always present, the children of Elam, but they never rise up for all of those centuries until 525 years before the Christian era. So Uh, in 1200, we see the Aramaeans. In 1159, we see the Elamite invasion. In 750, we see the Chaldean invasion. And in 613, the Persians merge their empire in an alliance with the Median Empire or the Medes. That's kind of the short history of Persia. So today we're going to start with the Ubaid culture of Sumer and work our way forward to the time of the Akkadian conquest of Sumer, 2330 BC, approximately, according to the secular historians. So let's go ahead and give me a second to bring up my master control. And let's go ahead and take a look then. Here's a more readable cartoon. 5000 BC, 4000 BC, 3300 BC. This gives you an idea of how we think the ancient Sumerians lived at different time periods. Or looking at this in terms of agriculture and technology, around 5000 BC, the historians tell us the Sumerian people move into Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BC, they built temples for their gods, and you can see this is a ziggurat. Those are the stairs. The Tower of Babel might have looked something like this. 4000 BC, pottery starts to be mass produced. Not that it begins for the first time, but they start mass producing it. And the reason we say it's mass produced is because we see that it becomes less ornate, not so personally decorated, which indicates it was being produced in modern equivalent would be a factory setting. You've got lots of laborers working to produce massive amounts of pots for distribution. So now they're being traded. 3300 BC, the Sumerians start to inscribe on clay tablets. In 3200 BC, the wheel is invented. Now think about what a society would be like if they didn't have a wheel. We don't really have to imagine it because the Indo-Europeans discovered it when they came to the Americas. They had not invented the wheel for thousands of years. The Incans, the Mayans, apparently never had wheels. But by the time the Americans got here, things were different. In 3000 BC, the Sumerians start to use mathematics. And they really, along with the Egyptians, are the, I don't want to say the inventors of mathematics, because mathematics is simply languages that describe the universe. You can actually use two mathematical languages to describe the universe. One is algebra and the other is geometry. But mathematics are not really so much created as they are discovered. But the New math? Yes, new math. Yeah. Well, that's a fair point. But what the Sumerians used was what we might think of as more traditional math, the kind of math that is just discovered, not created. So here's the Sumerian timeline at a glance. You can see I have a pictograph of a simple timeline of Sumer and when, but here's the basics. The history of the Sumerians, the earliest known civilization in southern Mesopotamia, can be divided into 6 eras. The Ubaid period, 5000 to 4100 BC. The Uruk period, 4100 to 2900 BCE. The early dynastic period, 2900 to 2334 BCE. Notice these are secular dates. That's why they say BCE. And then you come to the Akkadian period, 2334 to 2218, which is what we're going to talk about next Tuesday, or excuse me, next Monday. And then the Gutian period, 2218 to 2047. And then the Ur-3 period, which I would call the early Babylonian period, 2047 to 1750, also known as the Sumerian Renaissance. This is the time when the people began to be known as the Chaldeans or the ancient Babylonians. So during this time would be guys like Hammurabi the Great. And here are some of the important dates. The city of Eridu, according to the Sumerian timeline, was founded around 5400 BC. I would suggest that 5400 BC is probably early, since it would have been built in nothingness before there was even space. Similar with the city of Uruk, 4500 BC. The first temple is said to have been built around the same time, 4500 BC. Writing is invented somewhere around 3600 BC at Uruk, and the first code of laws around 2350 BC by Urukangina, the king of Lagash. It's interesting that his name begins with Uruk, but Urukangina is the king of Lagash, another city. 2150 to 1400 is when the Tales of Gilgamesh are written. And the decline of the third dynasty of Ur begins around 2004 BC, leading to the mass migrations during which the family of Terah, including Abram, began to migrate west. That is our overview. So let's begin to look at the Ubaid period. Historians say this period goes to 5400, or from 5400 to 4100 BC. I think it's actually the antediluvian Sumer that is described in the Sumerian Kings list as being before the flood swept over the land. And I think this is probably Canaanite culture. The early Sumerians believed that Eridu was the oldest city, and I think that that is possibly true, and that it is the city of Enoch that was built by Cain and named after his son. During this period, hunter-gatherers began cultivating crops. Remember, Cain was a gardener. Cain was a tiller of the earth. He was a guy who made crops, grew vegetables. His brother Abel was a shepherd. And probable, maybe even likely, that when Seth was born, he also was a keeper of flocks. Remember, Adam himself was placed in a garden and made the keeper of it. So, while I do believe that throughout history there have been bands of hunter-gatherers in many different ages, especially as they began to migrate into new places, right? If you leave the cities of Mesopotamia and you go north to where there are no cities and there are no farms, before you can start a farm, before you can plant a field of wheat, you have to survive the first winter. So hunting, gathering, storing for the winter would be how many groups would have spent their first years as they were planting their first crops in their fields. However, it seems to me from reading Genesis that the concept of farming, agriculture, did not have to be discovered or developed or created. It has always been here since the days of Adam. Um, but it appears that around cultivated land, the first communities grew up. You'll also see that in this period, temples appear to have been built to false gods, which reminds me of what Joshua said to the Israelites. You can, if you choose, worship the gods that your fathers served while in Egypt, or the gods that your fathers served on the other side of the flood. Now, it's possible that he's simply referring to the other side of the Jordan River or the other side of the Red Sea, since the word that he used for flood can also be used for a body of water. But I think it's likely that Joshua was referring to false gods being worshipped even before the flood, which would have been one of the reasons why God judged them so harshly. But temples are already being built to the false gods. Also, in this time period, from what we have dug up, it appears that canals were being built from the Euphrates River and the Tigris River as they were being fed from the Persian Gulf in order to bring the water to where their fields were so that their crops could be maintained. That's a pretty interesting innovation, especially if it was pre-flood, which I think it probably was. This goes back to something we've talked about before. We have this strange idea that the ancient peoples were ignorant and stupid, and we're getting smarter and smarter. But it's amazing how much more they accomplished with less. With more rudimentary tools, with less technology, without electricity. They were doing things like building canals to feed water to their fields of grain. Of course, then there's another question. Prior to the flood, how do we know they hadn't figured out how to harness electricity? We don't see any evidence of it, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Or maybe they had figured out ways to do things that we still haven't figured out, because technology tends to go in a forward direction, right? When you go down a particular path of technological development, you don't tend to go backward and say, if we hadn't done this, what if we had taken the other fork in the road and gone this way? So what might they have developed, for example, instead of an internal combustion engine? What might they have developed instead of a coal-burning train? What might they have developed instead of an electrical grid that would have powered the world before the flood? I couldn't tell you, because we would only be speculating. But the fact that they were building temples, they had built cities, they had cultivated crops, and they were building canals to bring water to their fields indicates to me that they were a lot smarter and more sophisticated than our minds, I guess you would say, our culturally and chronologically arrogant minds would have us believe. Also, during this time, sailing was invented. We see evidence of sailboats around the Persian Gulf dating back to the Ubaid period, which is likely antediluvian Sumer. Urbanization began to spread from the southern region around Eridu all the way north into northern Mesopotamia at the edges of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, where they come together up near Turkey. There's also evidence of Ubaid Sumerian artifacts in Arabia showing trade with other human societies. So we begin to see the trade between perhaps the sons of Cain and the other children of Adam during the latter part of this period. Any questions or thoughts about that before we move beyond the Ubaid period? Okay. Either everyone is enthralled or asleep. All right, here's a couple of nice pieces. This appears to be a sword, and this appears to be a clay tablet, and they are very, very interesting pictographs. These are not cuneiform, these are early pictographs that date to somewhere in the Uruk period, which I think is likely post-Diluvian Sumer. These dates are probably off by quite a bit, but this appears to be the re-establishment after the flood of the Sumerian culture, and these are very sophisticated pictographs that were apparently done before cuneiform was invented. Okay. This is the time of the Sumerian state. In other words, this is the point at which Sumeria began to have an ethnic national identity. They were still not what you would consider a formal one nation group. They were still a confederacy of independent city-states, but they began to think of themselves as part of a larger community, the Sumerian people. This would have been the time when Arphaxad would have been settling the lower part of this region in Sumer, and shortly after that, Ashur would have gone out from the lower Mesopotamia up to the place where his people lived that would be called Assyria in days to come. As their families grew and multiplied and more cities were founded and they began to spread out, there were cities, there were large cities, and there were also small hamlets. So instead of just having like one or two major cities and a whole bunch of little villages throughout Sumer, now we begin to see more large cities with smaller suburban cities and even small local townships developing. Over 60% of the population now live in towns. It's becoming very much an urbanized civilization. Kings and officers become more formalized. The size, if you will, of the bureaucracy starts to grow, because wherever there is society, there will follow bureaucracy. Elam, what we might think of as ancient Iran or Persia before it was Persia, begins to be colonized by Sumerians during this period. They're going beyond the Tigris, over the mountains, into the region of Elam, and they're colonizing their neighbors. This warish period, to me, makes me think that we are now either at or beyond the Babel period at the Tower of Babel, or we're getting very close to it. A drought at the end of this period caused people to return to southern Sumer, come back down from the south, and this led to an end of this colonial period under Uruk. In other words, they had started to go north and east in expansion, but because there was a drought, they returned to their central homeland of southern Mesopotamia in Sumer. And that is the end of the Uruk period. After the Uruk period comes the first or the early dynastic period. This is roughly 2900 to 2334, still in post-Diluvian Sumer, according to secular historians. Obviously, I still think those dates are off because it doesn't leave much time between the flood and now for that earlier period of the Uruk period. The early dynastic period of Mesopotamia is the modern day archaeological term for the era in Mesopotamian history, 2900 to 2334 BCE, during which some of the most significant cultural advances were made, including the rise of the cities, the development of writing, and the establishment of governments. That's a quote from historian Joshua Mark. This is the time, you notice the word dynastic, right, as in dynasty. This is the time where kingship becomes a birthright. Up until this point, the king of a city was generally chosen by the elders of the city, the men of the city, the people of the city. They would choose a king to rule them based on his merit. And so it was a merit-based kingship. If a king died, sometimes you would have a battle. Other times you would have something very much like an election, but in a less formal sense. Someone would rise up and the people would shout and declare him king. But now, for the first time in human history that we know of, kingship becomes a birthright. Sons follow their fathers. And of course, this eventually leads to the protogenitor, the firstborn, becoming the one who gets the birthright. Sumer is still never a single state, but a confederation of city-states. So there are still many kings, and the kings rule the large cities, or from the large cities, and their kingdoms would include the small suburbs and the tiny villages and townships around it. But there were always multiple kings ruling from the major cities in Sumer throughout the dynastic period. Floodwaters from the river erased at this time some of the cities that we remember from ancient Sumer. Like you'll notice in this map, at the end of the early dynastic period, when they rebuild after a flood, you no longer see a city of Eridu. You see Larsa, not far from where Eridu was, but Eridu would have been kind of right over here, northeast of Ur, southeast of Larsa. Some of the cities that had come to prominence before that flood were destroyed in a flood at that time. The early dynastic period is a time when the inscriptions began to be more pictographic. This appears to have been a picture of goods for trade, and it may have even been some kind of a contract or a receipt for a purchase. In the early dynastic period, post-Babel Sumer, you'll see that kingship is seen as a household. So the king is seen as a father, and the lines of his authority and his responsibility are somewhat taken from the idea of a family home, where you have the father whose job is to provide, to protect, and to be the priest over his household. He is the one who goes to the God and prays for the people. He is the one who is supposed to go out and earn with the sweat of his brow and the work of his hands the food that his family is going to eat. He is the one who provides them a home, and he is their protector against the elements and against enemies. So in like manner to the father, the king is seen as the one chosen by the gods to protect the people from invaders and from each other. He is also the one who is chosen to provide for the people good economic stability so people can earn a living. And he is seen as the one who goes to the gods to pray for favor for the city state. Here we have another example of what appears to be a list of goods, and they are represented by pictographs. Again, this is pre-cuneiform, so this tablet contains a list of goods that could be traded. During this second dynastic period, following the early dynastic period, you're going to see that there was a technological advancement. They got better at irrigation. They got better at smelting ores. They got better at making bronze and brass and iron. They also got better with their agricultural technology. They began to do things like use a plow, and they were figuring out how to domesticate animals for use in their fields. And the third early dynastic period, which continues into this area of 2900 to 2334. So you're talking now roughly 2600 to 2334, according to the chronology of secular history. This was the period that the city-state of Kish rose to dominance. The Kish era, if you will. The Kishite leadership of the Sumerian people. Some of their famous kings, their founder was Meshki-Gasher, who founded the city. Enmerkar, who we spoke about in great detail yesterday. Lugalbanda, Dumuz, and Gilgamesh, or Gilgamesh, depending on which inscription you're reading, ruled during this period. The first dynasty of Lagash is also in this period. And so there began to be war between Kish and Lagash, and between Uruk and Kish. And between Lagash and Uruk and Kish. At this time, they even had some wars with Elam, because the second king of this dynasty, Eannatum of Lagash, prayed to Enlil to help him conquer. And not only did he fight with Uruk and Kish, he also went east and invaded Elam. So the ancient Persians were experiencing the overflow, if you will, of the quest or the thirst for territory from Eannatum when he went to conquer. It's interesting that Eannatum is one of the earliest would-be conquerors in history. He doesn't seem to have been terribly successful, but he was a king who wanted to expand his empire through conquest. This is a picture of an ancient ziggurat. It was dug up in this region. You'll notice that on the bottom you can see some signs of water damage, and this is because of the continuous flooding that occurs throughout the region, because that's what happens when you have the Persian Gulf to your south and a river on your west and a river on your east side. Pretty much once a year there's going to be some flooding, and it's just a question of how bad it is. Notice the staircase leading up, the staircase leading down. The idea was that this is where the gods would come down to man, and where the priests would go up into the presence of God. So you'll find these ziggurats all over the Middle East, and especially in the region around the Mesopotamian area. I think, and most historians also think, that the Tower of Babel was such a ziggurat. May have even been the first one. Building a tower to reach to heaven sounds very much like a ziggurat. So Nimrod may have been the first one to do this, but it became very common everywhere they went. Any questions about early dynastic Sumer? Okay. Wow, we're whipping through this pretty fast today. That's going to bring us to the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the most interesting stories of the ancient world. And really, it's a collection of stories because it's 5 stories about the king Gilgamesh, who you may recall we just talked about. Gilgamesh was one of the kings of the Uruk period. So when we go to Uruk, we see this is the area when a drought at the end of this period caused all of the old cities, or not all, but some of the old cities to be destroyed. Then we come into a place where we get into the early dynastic period. And from there, we go into the second or middle dynastic period. And then we get into the place where we're in the post-Babel Sumer in the dynastic period, and then the third early dynastic period. What's interesting about this is during this last period, before the first dynasty of Lagash, or perhaps at the same time, Gilgamesh ruled this area. He was one of the rulers of Kish, who came up after Uruk, but he was his predecessors were Meshki-Gashar the founder, Enmerkar or Enmer the hunter, Lugalbanda, and Dumus. Meshki-Gashar was never elevated to godhead. Enmerkar, Enmer the hunter, was never made a god. Lugalbanda and Dumus were made gods, and Gilgamesh is said to be a demigod. His exploits became the stuff of legends and myths, but all of the records we have of them are from later periods of Mesopotamian history. We don't have, other than the Sumerian Kings list, which says very little about Gilgamesh, we don't have the we don't have the current contemporaneous stories of Gilgamesh. But here's what we have. The most complete compilation of the epic is on 12 incomplete Akkadian tablets found at Nineveh in Ashurbanipal's library. So, how many of you guys are caught up to the Epic of Gilgamesh in your reading assignments? A little bit? Yes, I believe so. Yeah, the first epic hero, or the first action hero, you could say. This is what ancient action movies or comic books looked like back in the day. You're almost there? Okay. Well, you're going to read more about this in the next few days then. So this is what a comic book looked like in the ancient world. Clay tablet, 2 columns, and writing on each side. This is a fragment of a 2-column tablet. You can tell that it's broken in places where there are supposed to be words that we cannot see because it's broken. Okay. This is one of the tablets from the 12 incomplete Akkadian tablets found at Nineveh in Ashurbanipal's library. So they're called Akkadian tablets because they are written in the Akkadian language, which means that they were probably written after the time of Gilgamesh, but shortly after the time of Gilgamesh, during the time of the Akkadian Empire, which we're going to talk about on Monday. What's interesting about that is even though these are from the library of Ashurbanipal, and Ashurbanipal lived like in the 6th to 7th century BC, so almost 2,000 years after Gilgamesh is expected to have lived. Um, it seems that these might be much older tablets or that they had been copied from much older tablets because they're written in a language that hasn't been spoken in centuries. Okay? Um, so, tablet number 1, Gilgamesh and Huwa, is the story that introduces Gilgamesh as the king of Uruk. Gilgamesh is 2/3 God and 1/3 man, which apparently means he had 3 parents. No, I'm just kidding. He is oppressing his people. He is a cruel dictator. So his people do what any reasonable people would do when your dictator is oppressing you. You send writers throughout all of the colonies, and you gather together a Continental Congress, and you decide you're going to ask each of the states to declare independence, and you start a revolutionary war. No, that's not what they did. They cried out to their gods for help. They were asking for help. And so, for the young women of Uruk, for example, this takes the form of what is called the droit de seigneur, or the Lord's right, which is to sleep with brides on their wedding night. For the young men, it is conjectured that Gilgamesh wears them out through endless games, tests of strength, and forced labor on his building projects, leaving them little time and energy to care for their families and their trades or farms. However, the tablet is somewhat damaged at the point where it speaks about the young men, so we're not entirely sure that we know exactly what those tasks were. So the gods respond to the people's pleas by creating an equal to Gilgamesh who will be able to stop his oppression. This is the legendary Enkidu. Now, I want you to, as you're listening to this story, I want you to think about whether or not this reminds you of any stories from the Greeks, the Romans, the Far Asians, from the African nations and tribes, or even from the Americas or indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world. Although I would make the argument all people are indigenous to Mesopotamia because that's where Eden was. Other than that, everybody's a migrant. So it is the gods respond by sending Enkidu, who is covered in hair, and he lives in the wild. He at first appears to not have the reason of a man. He's first noticed by a trapper, a hunter who is using traps, right? And he finds that Enkidu is uprooting his traps. So the trapper tells the sun god, Shamash, about this man beast, and it is arranged for Enkidu to be seduced by a temple prostitute named Shamhat. Interestingly enough, apparently, after spending 6 days and 7 nights in the company of this temple prostitute, he is tamed and he has a more human-like mind. So apparently, that's the key to wisdom in ancient Mesopotamia. Enkidu then goes about trying to learn civilization from his temple prostitute consort. she takes Enkidu to a shepherd's camp to learn how to be civilized. Because there's nothing in the world more civilized than a shepherd. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, keeps having dreams about the imminent arrival of a beloved new companion, and he asks his mother, who is none other than the goddess Ninsun, to help interpret these dreams. The second tablet tells us that Shamhat eventually brings Enkidu to the shepherd's camp. He's introduced to a human diet and becomes a night watchman. Learning from a passing stranger about Gilgamesh's treatment of new brides, Enkidu is incensed. Remember, this is a guy who lives with a prostitute. Enkidu is incensed, morally outraged, and he travels to Uruk, and he's going to intervene at the next wedding to prevent this atrocity from happening again. When Gilgamesh attempts to visit the wedding chamber, Enkidu gets in his path and says, "You're not doing this. I'm not going to let you. You got to go through me." So naturally, Gilgamesh says, "All right, you got a point. Let's go have some beers." No, actually, Gilgamesh says, "You want to fight about it?" And the two go to blows. And after they beat each other senseless, Enkidu acknowledges that Gilgamesh has superior strength, and they become friends. Now think about this for a moment. This beast created by the gods has found this demigod human god hybrid, and he says to him, I am going to be your friend now because you're stronger than I am. So there are, I think, vestiges of this that have made their way into the story of the Minotaur. So think about that for a moment. All right, so they become friends, and Gilgamesh proposes a journey to the cedar forest so that they can slay a monstrous demigod known as Umbaba in order to become famous and be remembered and gain immortality through the stories of others. Even though Enkidu and the elders of Gilgamesh say, the elders of Gilgamesh's city, Uruk, say this should not be done, Gilgamesh goes anyway. On tablet 3, the elders give Gilgamesh advice for his journey, and so Gilgamesh starts by going to visit his mother, the goddess Ninsun, and she seeks the support and protection of the sun god Shamash for this adventure that the boys are going to go on. Now keep in mind, this man is the king of Uruk, the leading city-state of the confederacy of the cities of Sumer, and he wants to take time off from feeding and protecting and nourishing his people to go off on a quest for personal glory to defeat the monster in the woods. But that's what happens. Ninsun then adopts Enkidu as her son, so Gilgamesh and his newfound brother leave instructions for how Uruk is to be governed while they're gone. Tablet 4. Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey to the cedar forest. Every few days they camp on a mountain. They have dreams in their rituals, or they have dream rituals of things that they're doing in their sleep, kind of like waking dreams. Gilgamesh has 5 terrifying dreams about mountains falling, about thunderstorms, about wild bulls, and about a thunderbird that breathes fire. Despite similarities between his dream figures and the earlier descriptions of Humbaba, Enkidu interprets these dreams as good omens and denies that the frightening images represent the forest guardian. As they approach the cedar mountain, they hear Humbaba bellowing and have to encourage each other not to be afraid. In tablet 5, the heroes enter the cedar forest. Umbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest, insults and threatens them, and of course, the battle commences. Um, Over the course of time, they manage to kill the beast Umbaba, and then they begin to chop down cedar trees to build for themselves a temple or a temple gate for the temple of Enlil. They build a raft and they return home along the Euphrates with the giant tree and possibly, some say, the head of Umbaba. At this time, the goddess Ishtar, for whom Easter is later named, decides that she's tired of being mistreated by her previous lovers, like Dumuzi, one of Gilgamesh's ancestors. So Ishtar becomes angry and she says, I want to marry Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh says, no, I don't think so. You have a reputation for taking human or half human, or in his case, 2/3 human husbands and mistreating them very badly. I don't want to be married to a woman who mistreats her husband, even if she is a goddess. So, no, thank you. I'm out. She becomes angry and she refuses to allow him to enter into Iana, and he begins to interfere with his business. So Ishtar asks her father, Anu, the great god, to send Gula'ana, the bull of heaven, to avenge her. And that's when the bull of heaven, the second adventure, begins. And in this, Anu states that if he gives the bull of heaven to her, Uruk will face 7 years of famine. Ishtar provides him with provisions for 7 years in exchange for the bull. Ishtar leads the bull of heaven to Uruk, and he causes widespread devastation. The people watch as the bull drinks nonstop but cannot be satisfied until he lowers the river Euphrates level down and dries up all the marshes. He opens up huge pits in the ground that swallow 300 men. Without any divine assistance, Enkidu and Gilgamesh murder the bull and offer up his heart to Shamash. When Ishtar cries out, Enkidu hurls one of the hindquarters of the bull at her. The city of Uruk celebrates, but Enkidu has an ominous dream about his future failure. So before we go on with some of the more pertinent to biblical stories, do you see a lot of similarities in some of the Greek and Roman myths that you've heard? I see Lauren's head nodding. What are you thinking of? Kevin, I saw your head nodding as well. What were you thinking of? Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Interesting. Gilbert, any thoughts? Contrast? Oh, yes, yes. Well, like I said, this is what a comic book looks like in the ancient world. Um, so, interestingly enough, the Bull of Heaven story takes an interesting turn. They have vanquished the beast. They have returned in victory to the city of Uruk. And guess what happens next? Well, remember, a goddess asked Anu, the king of the gods, for permission to use the Bull of Heaven to attack this demigod and his beast man adopted brother. But now the two boys are in trouble with the gods because they killed the Bull of Heaven. And so the gods decree that one of them must die. And ultimately, of course, it's not Gilgamesh because there's three more stories to come after this one. He's got to be around for the sequel. Um, it's Enkidu. Enkidu is marked for death, and there's going to be a great funeral. They're going to have great honors for him. They're going to celebrate him. But he keeps having these dreams of his upcoming death, and he's not okay with the fact that he has to die. He wishes he had never been civilized. He's angry at his prostitute friend. He's angry at the shepherds. He's angry at the trapper. He's angry at the world because he's going to die. And Enkidu eventually regrets his curses. He blesses Shamhat, and in a second dream, however, he sees himself being taken captive to the netherworlds. And the netherworlds is depicted as a house of dust and darkness, and the inhabitants eat clay. Why would you eat clay? That just sounds pitiful. Um, For 12 days, Enkidu's condition worsens. Finally, he dies after lamenting that he couldn't die a hero's death in battle. And then, in a famous line, Gilgamesh grabs a hold of the body of his now dead friend, brother, Beast Boy, and denies that he has died until a maggot drops out of his nose. just to make it gross. On the eighth, yep. Um, the eighth tablet in the Epic of Gilgamesh, according to the 12 incomplete Akkadian tablets, tells the story of the funeral of Enkidu. Gilgamesh delivers the great speech. There's a big banquet. There's a funerary statue, and they apparently bury him at sea because there's something about the river being dammed up, and there's a burial in a riverbed. And there's a Sumerian poem that tells the story of the funeral of Enkidu in the same way. Um, that would be the death of Gilgamesh. Tablet 9 of the Epic of Gilgamesh opens with a Gilgamesh who's roaming the wild wearing skins. He's dressed up like a caveman, and he's brokenhearted, boo-hooing because he's missing his friend Enkidu. But now, having seen the death of his adopted brother, the Beast Boy, he begins to fear that if Enkidu could die, then what if Gilgamesh could die? It suddenly occurs to the demigod that he's not all God and he's therefore mortal, and mortal people die. So, having now become fearful of that, he decides to seek for Utnapishtim. Does anyone remember who Utnapishtim is? This is the Mesopotamian name for Noah. He is the hero of their great flood story. Utnapishtim means something like the horizon, the far away, over there, the far one. And he wants to go find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim and his wife have survived the flood, so he goes looking for him. Along the way, he has a bunch of adventures. There's a lion that crosses his path. There's a moon god that comes upon him. He believes that Utnapishtim and his wife have been granted immortality, which would make sense from the standpoint that Noah lived for hundreds of years after the flood, as the lifespan of other men became shorter and shorter and shorter, right? So his immortality would be something based in some sort of historical reality. After a while, he has killed a bunch of beasts, including some lions. He arrives at the twin peaks of the mountain, Mashu, at the very end of the earth. And he comes to a tunnel. He enters. It's guarded by monsters. They're scorpions, and he realizes that the scorpion monsters are actually, or if you prefer, the lizard people, are actually a married couple, right? And the scorpion monsters are trying to dissuade Gilgamesh from seeking to get to this path that he's on. Eventually, though, he continues on, and he allows the passage of Gilgamesh. He goes under the mountains along the road of the sun. In complete darkness, he's journeying under the mountains, and and he follows the road for something like 24 hours or 12 double hours, which leads him after a complete day to the end of the trip. Before the sun catches up with him, he arrives at the Garden of the Gods. Think about that. He goes to seek for Utnapishtim at the Garden of the Gods, which is a paradise full of jewel-laden trees. So, what do you think the garden paradise of the gods with jewel-laden trees is derived from? The Garden of Eden. Probably no longer on earth after the flood, but in the early days of man, for somewhere around 17 centuries, it was there and you could travel to it, you just couldn't enter it because the cherubim wouldn't let you in. So, to speed up the story a little bit, Tablet 11 continues to he continues to go to Utnapishtim, and along the way he meets a few other people. He keeps looking for where he's trying to go, but when he finally reaches Utnapishtim, Gilgamesh tells him the story and asks for his help, and Utnapishtim reprimands him, and he says, "No, I'm not doing this. Fighting the common fate of humans is wrong. You're mortal. You die. Get over it." Gilgamesh doesn't just turn around and leave angry, though. He asks Utnapishtim, how did he become immortal? And he explains to him that the gods decided to send a great flood. And so, in order to save Utnapishtim, Enki told him to build a boat. He gave him the exact size that the boat was supposed to be. Does that sound familiar? And he built the boat. He was also told to pitch it with bitumen. Does that sound familiar? His entire family got on the boat, and together with his craftsmen and all the animals of the field, they waited for the storm. And then the storm came, and the storm even made the gods terrified. And eventually, they retreated into the heavens, the gods, that is. Ishtar, the goddess, regrets the wholesale destruction of all of mankind. She's angry about that. After 6 days and 6 nights, all human beings had turned to clay, not died, but turned to clay. And now Utnapishtim weeps at his destruction. His boat lodges on a mountain called Nimmush, and he sends out a dove, a swallow, and a raven. When the raven fails to return, he opens up the ark and frees the inhabitants. Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice to his gods, and the sweet-smelling savor of the sacrifice causes all the gods to gather around. Ishtar makes a promise that she is never going to forget this brilliant man, and she will always appreciate the necklace that he made for her. And Enlil, he becomes angry, and he is furious that there are survivors of the flood because it was supposed to destroy all mankind. So the god Enlil gets angry not just at them, but also at her because she instigated this. So now Enki is also going to respond to Enlil. Remember, Anu and Enki, these are the primary gods, right? And he says this was an out of proportion punishment. This was unjust. The people were bad, but you shouldn't have killed them all. And as a result, Enlil then will give eternal life to Utnapishtim and his wife. Um, Interestingly enough, this story matches a flood story in another epic from the ancient world, the epic of Ultrahasis. I say matches. I mean, not exactly word for word, but there are incredible similarities between another ancient world epic, the epic of Ultrahasis or Hasis, that is very similar. Um, the interesting thing, though, is that um, Utnapishtim, it seems, has a unique gift of eternal life, and he cannot give a secret away that he doesn't possess. So Gilgamesh begins to cry and weep and mourn because of the futility of all his journey and all of his exploits, because now he cannot be immortal. So he goes back to Uruk and he sees the size of its massive walls and he begins to praise this enduring work. So the last tablet, tablet 12 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. It's an Akkadian translation of the earlier Sumerian poem about Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. Sometimes it's called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. So this tablet tells another version of the story, and the contents of the tablet are inconsistent with the previous ones. In this one, Enkidu is still alive. He did not die, despite the fact that he died earlier. So that tends to make some people think that the 12th tablet was added at another time. It has also been suggested that Gilgamesh has uh, um, has decided that the dead in the afterlife should be able to escape, and somehow that's what's happening here. There is a complaint from Gilgamesh to Enkidu that some of his possessions, what those possessions are, we don't know, have gone to the underworld. So Enkidu offers to bring them back. So he's essentially, this is a resurrection story where Enkidu returns from the dead and brings back his possessions to his brother. Enkidu does everything that he was told not to do when he goes to the underworld, and so the underworld will not release him. Gilgamesh prays to the gods, and they give him back his friend. So again, it's a resurrection story. But it's contradicting the previous tablets, and it's contradicting other Sumerian stories. But what would you expect from the world's oldest comic book? Continuity breaks are just part of comics, right? Shamash makes a crack in the earth. This would be, of course, their mom. And Enkidu's ghost jumps out of it. And so Gilgamesh is questioning Enkidu about what it's like in the underworld when the tablet abruptly ends. And this is the legendary epic of Gilgamesh in a nutshell. If you would like, I could read it to you from the Akkadian, but first I'm going to have to go learn Akkadian. All right, so we have a couple minutes left. I'm going to throw it back to you guys for some comment. Utnapishtim, the boat, the flood, the gods and goddesses. What similarities do you see there? Any polytheistic culture? Okay. It is interesting, though, how many similarities there are between what really happened with Noah and the flood, according to Genesis, and what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh's Utnapishtim story, the ancient Sumerian flood story, right? Remember, we've already seen the Sumerian kings list that tells us there was a flood from Sumer in ancient Iraq. And now we see from Uruk, also in Sumer, in ancient Iraq, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is much later in terms of the origin of the story, and even later than that when it was written down. Very good. Kevin? Very good. Thank you guys for your attention.